So in this drawing, I'm doing a gesture drawing of my fabric into a toned ground with charcoal. And I'm just trying to find the main bigger shapes of my fabric right now, which takes some time. Lots of little details, but the first thing that I did was get the big overall shape to figure out how it's going to fit on my page, and use some sighting methods for proportion and different scale of different parts. It's like this, you know, what does that triangle look like, that big shape, compared to what happens here and what happens here. Finding center points is also a good way to start out your drawing. From here, I'm going to block in major contours, major shapes, and maybe block in some shapes of light, because the next step will be subtracting from the drawing with my erasers the light. And then after that, it will be a push and pull for light and shadow. So I'm just going to finish this gesture drawing and maybe tighten it up a little bit, figure out all of this, and then we'll move on to the subtraction method. Okay, so I am done with my gesture drawing, and now I'm going to go in and pick out the lights. And as I do that, I'm going to be squinting at my still life to break down some of the detail and see it more clearly. And I'm only pulling out shapes of like my lightest lights to start. And I'm also going to start pushing in some darker shadows for cast shadows, maybe in this area, down here, and in the backdrop with my charcoal stick, possibly even my vine charcoal. For picking out, subtracting the drawing out to get your lights, I'm going to start with my kneaded eraser. And the reason I want to use this to start is because as you're pulling out, it's going to get really filled with the charcoal. So a kneaded eraser is great for just renewing. So once this is warmed up and it's really flexible and soft, you can just, every time you pull out a passage, renew it. So just starting with the lights, I'm squinting, just kind of looking through my lashes to pull out my brightest brights. And I can shape this to get smaller shapes. One more thing, like when you're doing your drawing, this took me a while because there's a lot of angles, a lot of sighting that needs to go into it for proportions and direction and getting into the details. As it starts to come out, it's easier to see, you know, little areas, like look at your negative shapes. That's really important. Areas like this, what's your midpoint, what's happening, you know, all around. It doesn't have to be a super clean, linear mechanical drawing. It can just be nice and loose like this, because in the end, this is going to be only about the value and not about line. Some of the gesture drawing might show through, and that's okay. It shows the history of a drawing, which gives it a lot of energy. But that's not my focus. My focus is to capture the folds, the volume, so the light. As the light hits, like right here, it's hitting really strong. So that would be, when I squint, this area is my brightest. So that's where I'm going to pull out the most. And then everything is a notch down as far as value. It gets a little bit darker. I'm going to go at this carefully. I'm not going to just rip out big, sections of value, because then I have to put it back in. I'm just going to do my brightest bright. So something like this, a shape like this. It's not completely one value from here to here. There's a little bit of darker value in the middle. So I'm going to find maybe along the edges before it turns over into shadow. It tends to get a little brighter. So I'm going to start pulling out a little bit. I'm not going to go crazy yet. And you can go with the direction of the fabric if you want. And this is just to give me an idea to start out really fast what things look like. So this midtone is here to act as all of your middle values so that you don't have to go and put it back in. So you're going to leave it wherever you see it. Okay, so I have picked out my larger shapes of light, gotten into some of my brightest brights that still need to go a little bit brighter, but I'm going to use my hard erasers for that. So it's still very rough, but it's starting to come out. You're starting to see the volume a little bit. Basically blocking in bigger shapes like cast shadows throughout here, but you can see here it's very loose. It's still a lot of gesture drawing left. We're just kind of mapping things out. At this point, and also I started blocking in some of my darker cast shadows, but in shadow there's a lot of reflective light. There are darker areas, so in order to push and pull that with more finesse, you're going to want to use your pencils. I use the Vine charcoal throughout all of this because it's easier for me to blend it and it doesn't get too dark too fast. I want to get into that more gradually because it is off-white fabric. I'm working from a canvas, and when I squint at it, I don't see black. I see mid-range gray to light. So it'll be a very kind of high-key drawing. If you are working with a very white fabric and there's very bright whites and your paper isn't a bright white, there is something that you can do to kind of fool the eye, is push your contrast a little bit more. So pick out the lights as much as you can. So like here, if I have really bright lights and I've used my erasers, to pull out as much as possible, and it still just doesn't feel as bright as what I'm looking at, you can push some of your shadows a little bit darker, and that gives the illusion of that glow. Again, you want to be squinting at your still life so that you can really see it and break down those values, simplify them. From this point, I'm going to be using everything. I'm going to be still probably using my kneaded eraser to kind of work some areas. I'm going to use my pencils. I'm going to use my fancy new eraser I have here, some hard erasers, or if you have ones that have like corners on them, those are nice too. And I'm going to start pushing and pulling the texture and the more subtle nuances. So in an area like this, I'm working with my number 3 charcoal, which is like it's a kind of hard, not too soft because I don't want to go too dark. But I've got a fold here that kind of goes up and then goes away from light. So light's hitting right here. And then in here, it's gonna be a little bit darker. And then over here, there's more light. So the easiest way to do that is start kind of maybe using the side of your pencil, and where you see the darker darks, which would be core shadow, start laying it in. Maybe find some edges between light and shadow, and go into it softly, subtly, going into those smaller shapes of value now. So you're going to start defining some detail. And I'm still just going to use continuous tone before I get in. If I decide to do any hatching or anything like that, I'll save that for the end. But right now, I just want to get all those smaller shapes of value because there's a lot of detail throughout here where I can get pretty dark. You gotta really pay attention, and then also find like wherever you see reflective light in little spots, try and capture that. Where wrinkles kind of bend like this kind of thing, really look at those areas, look at the angles. Is it a curve? Are there straights and curves? Things like that, where it really, this is a little fold that comes out and then it goes in away from light. So looking at that little shape of value, dark shadow. And then this is a light edge, and then there's kind of a cast shadow in here. So I'm going to go a little bit darker in there. So you're going to do this all over, just section by section. You can finish off an area if you want, and then move on to another area. That's a good way to see like how much finish you want. Or another option could be, within your piece, do you have a focal point where you want to really define a certain area of it and let the rest of it stay a little bit loose? That's another option. I'm probably going to define most of this, and then as it comes out, it'll get less defined. Not worrying so much about these outer areas. You can finish the whole thing up to any degree that you want. That's completely up to you. Your final, stuff that you're going to be working on is like edging, really getting into the smaller shapes. Wherever you see a hard edge, make that comparison to something like back here. It'd be soft, even though like the fabric and the edge is hard, it's very straight. The contrast between this value and this value is very close. So it's very hard to actually see the edge of the fabric. That can be kind of just really soft, not really defined. Where light comes up against, especially like cast shadow, and you really see the edge, pop that a little bit more, define the edge more. Over here, I'm really gonna see it. So I'm gonna make sure that's sharp. So along your outer edges, you can have a combination of like lost and found contour. Doesn't necessarily mean using a line, but just how clearly you see the edge in different spots. Because when we look at things, our eyes focus on an area. So if I'm focused here, stuff over here may not be as crisp. as this area, or if I'm focused here, this may not be as crisp. It's just how we see. Our peripheral, plays tricks on us and can't see everything super clear on the outskirts of our vision. So you can play with a focal point. Stuff over here, it's going to be very loose. I'm going to leave it a little loose. I like leaving a little bit of gesture drawing to show history, where I'm going to really get into this area as much as I can with the small shapes of value. Tiny, or if I see line, I'll draw it. Otherwise, something like this, that's going to disappear because there's actually a shape of value. It's very thin, of darker value that goes into this fabric underneath. So you can see, like, I'm going to pull the value of that line into my fabric and I lose the contour. If you go and pull out too much, put it back in and just, jump around, work wherever you feel like it. And just kind of fine tune, and eventually things will start to reveal themselves. And I'm using my finger to blend and soften a lot, which is nice about charcoal because you can do that. It is a very soft medium. Just make sure you don't take off too much. So if you want to like lay in kind of, if I have a light tone, I toned my paper and I left it kind of light. You could go a little bit darker, even this value, so that you don't have to add in as much, but you will have to erase more. So you got to pick your battles. I kind of went lighter because I have white fabric, and overall my reflective light and kind of midtones are in this range. I just had to add a little bit to my cast shadow because it has a lot of light in here. Yeah, so most of it's going to be like this with some darker shadows and highlights. So by the end of this, hopefully this shape will be the brightest, kind of coming down into here and then a little bit in here. Everything else will be mid-tone, reflective light, and cast shadow. That's the goal anyways.